The morning the palace fell silent, nobody was prepared for it. It started the way most terrible things do, quietly, without warning, in a room that smelled of old wood polish and cut flowers that had been arranged by hands paid never to speak about what they saw. The curtains in the east wing were still drawn. The clocks ticked. The staff moved through the corridors the way they always moved, with soft shoes and softer eyes, trained by years of service to look at everything and register nothing. But that morning something was different, and even the most senior footman, a man who had worked in royal households for 31 years and prided himself on having no feelings about any of it, felt the difference settle into his chest like cold water finding a crack in stone. Princess Charlotte had not come down for breakfast. This was not, on its own, remarkable. Royals missed breakfast. They slept late or rose at 4 in the morning depending on their schedule, their temperament, the night before. But Charlotte was not like that. Charlotte had been the kind of woman who arrived early to everything, who considered punctuality a form of respect and lateness a form of arrogance she could not abide. The household staff knew her schedule the way they knew the weather, not because they were told it each day, but because it had never changed. 8 o'clock. Dressed. Composed. Ready. So when 8:15 came and then 8:30 and then 9, and no one had heard the particular sound of her heels on the marble floor of the east corridor, the silence that filled the space where that sound should have been started to feel like something living. It was a junior housemaid named Saoirse who first went to check. She was 19, new enough to the position that she still noticed things the others had trained themselves to stop seeing. She knocked on the door to the princess's private sitting room. Once. Twice. She pushed the door open 2 inches and called the princess's name, softly, the way you'd call into a dark room you weren't entirely sure you wanted an answer from. What she saw made her close the door, walk back down the corridor at exactly the same pace she had walked up it, and then find the head housekeeper and say 3 words in a voice that had gone very flat and very careful. She needs someone. The head housekeeper, a formidable Scottish woman named Mrs. Drummond who had outlasted 4 private secretaries and 1 prime minister's visit that had nearly taken a decade off her life, did not ask questions. She went. She knocked. She entered. What happened in that room in the next few minutes would be whispered about for weeks in the below-stairs world of the household, passed between staff members in the careful, coded language people use when they're afraid of being overheard and more afraid of what they're saying. But the broad shape of it, the thing that could not be hidden even by people trained in the art of hiding, was this: Princess Charlotte had broken down. Not the polished, contained, careful version of distress that royals were trained to display if they had to display anything at all. Not a diplomatic sadness or a photogenic grief. Something else. Something that had no diplomacy in it and no performance and no awareness of the cameras that had spent decades teaching her face to behave. Mrs. Drummond would not describe what she found in specific terms to anyone, not then, not later, not ever. But she did say to her assistant that afternoon, with a steadiness that cost her something to maintain, that she had never in 30 years of service seen anything like it. The sitting room had been in disorder. That was perhaps the most striking thing, more striking, even, than the princess herself, because the room was always immaculate. Charlotte was a woman who made her bed when she was ill and straightened picture frames as a reflex. The disorder meant whatever had happened fast, or had happened over a long time in the dark, or both. By 9:30, the household had been instructed not to approach that wing without explicit request. By 10, 3 people who had not been there at 9:30 appeared, faces the junior staff did not recognize, carrying the particular blankness of people whose job is to manage situations that cannot be put in a file. By 10:15, the corridors near the east wing had been quietly emptied of anyone who didn't need to be there. The palace had gone into a kind of controlled silence that is different from ordinary quiet. Ordinary quiet is the absence of sound. This silence was the active suppression of it, a silence maintained by effort, like holding your breath underwater. Everyone could feel the pressure of it. No one named it. Outside the palace grounds, the day was entirely normal. Cars moved through London with their ordinary indifference. The weather was doing what English weather does in that particular grey and uncommitted way. People drank coffee and argued about parking and scrolled through their phones, and none of them knew that inside the stone walls with the flagged courtyard and the tourists photographing the gates, something had cracked. But, in a household like that one, nothing stays contained. Not entirely. Not forever. The first person outside the immediate household to understand that something had happened was a guard named James Whitmore. He had been posted near the east corridor that morning, not inside it, but close enough. He was 34, 12 years in royal protection, a man who had developed the ability to read a building the way other people read faces. He knew which silences were nothing and which ones were load-bearing. He had felt the shift before he'd seen anything that confirmed it, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before the storm arrives. He noticed the three faces he didn't recognize. He noticed the rerouting of staff. He noticed that Mrs. Drummond, who walked with the authority of a ship in full sail, had spent 20 minutes standing very still in the corridor outside the kitchens looking at nothing in particular. He filed it in the part of his mind where he kept things that hadn't yet become information. It became information at 11:17 when he was standing at his post and heard, from behind a closed door to his left, a voice he recognized and a voice he didn't. The voice he recognized belonged to a senior aide whose name he knew. The voice he didn't belong to a woman, and the conversation they were having was not one they would have had if they'd known anyone was close enough to hear. He caught fragments. The way you always catch fragments, not the whole sentence but the words with the most weight, the ones that stick. He heard the name Camilla. He heard the phrase she was never supposed to find out. He heard the word letters. He stood very still. The door did not open. The voices moved away from it. He remained at his post for the rest of his shift with the professional blankness his 12 years had built in him, and he did not move, and he did not react, and he thought about what he'd heard with the slow careful attention of a man who understood that what he now knew was not nothing. He understood something else, too. He understood that Princess Charlotte's breakdown, whatever had caused it, was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle. And, somewhere, in rooms that the household cameras didn't reach and the staff weren't permitted to enter, the beginning of the story was already over. He went home that evening and sat in his kitchen for a long time before he made himself eat dinner. He thought about the word letters. He thought about what kind of secret, when found, could undo a woman who had never, in all his years of watching her, been undone. He thought about Camilla. He did not sleep well. In the morning he went back. He stood at his post. He watched the palace move around its womb the way water moves around a stone, smoothly, continuously, as if the stone isn't there. Charlotte did not emerge from the east wing. The three faces from the day before were gone, replaced by different faces with the same blankness. And, somewhere in the building, behind a door that would not open to someone like James Whitmore, whatever was in those letters was either being dealt with or being buried, and he could not yet tell which. That uncertainty, the not knowing, sat in him the whole day like something he'd accidentally swallowed, something with an edge. He had been trained, all his years in this work, to protect. He had never been trained for the possibility that the thing requiring protection might be the truth itself, and that the threat to it might be wearing the right face and living in the right rooms and smiling in the right photographs. But he was starting to understand that this was what he was dealing with. And, understanding it, he recognized with the calm of someone who had already made their decision without quite knowing when they'd made it, meant he was going to have to do something about it. The palace flagged in the gray morning light. The tourists at the gates lifted their cameras. The clocks inside kept their reliable measure of a time that felt, in that east wing, briefly suspended. James Whitmore stood at his post. He waited. He had learned, in 12 years, that patience was not passive. Patience was a form of readiness. You waited because something was coming, and you wanted to be prepared for it when it arrived, and not caught in the middle of moving when you should have been still. Something was coming. He could feel it the same way he'd felt the silence the morning before, in the body first, before the mind caught up. He stood still. He waited. The palace held its breath around him, and, in the east wing, behind a closed door, a princess who had never broken in public carried the weight of something she had not chosen to know, and the day moved forward the way days do, without asking anyone whether they were ready for it. The letters existed in a box that should not have existed. That was the first thing, the container. A flat, cream-colored archive box, the kind used in formal record-keeping, stamped with a reference number that corresponded to no file in the official household registry. Someone had created the number. Someone with access to the system, with the knowledge of how official things were labeled so that unofficial things could shelter inside that labeling and be invisible. Whoever had done it had been careful. Had been patient. Had understood that the best place to hide something is inside a system so large and so orderly that a single extra entry draws no eye. The box had sat in the document archive of the East Residential Wing for 2 years. Charlotte had found it by accident. This was the kind of accident that is not entirely an accident, the kind that requires a specific set of small circumstances to align before the larger one becomes possible. She had been looking for an old correspondence file, something relating to a charitable trust she had been involved with for a decade, a file that her personal secretary had been unable to locate through the usual channels. Charlotte had gone herself because she had learned early in her public life that when you wanted something found, you frequently had to be the one to find it. She went to the archive room on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, in the way she occasionally did things, direct and without ceremony, which was both a quality her staff loved about her and a quality that, on this particular Tuesday, changed everything. She pulled the wrong box. She knew it was wrong immediately from the reference number, but she opened it anyway because she was thorough, because she intended to put it back where it came from, because she was curious in the way private people are curious when no one is watching openly, without performance. She looked at the first letter. She read the date at the top, and the salutation, and the first paragraph. She put the letter down. She stood in the archive room for what the security camera footage would later show was 4 minutes and 22 seconds, completely still, not touching anything. Then, she picked the letter up again and read it through to the end. Then, the second one. Then, the third. She read all of them in order, in the archive room, standing up, because she never sat down, she never found the chair, or didn't look for it, or her body didn't allow the instruction to reach her legs. She stood and she read and she did not make a sound. When she left the archive room, she was carrying the box. This was the second thing. The carrying of it. The not putting it back. The taking of it down the corridor and into her private sitting room and the closing of the door behind her with the care of someone who does not want to be heard closing a door. Mrs. Drummond's assistant, a young woman named Priya who had been with the household 8 months and still had the observational freshness of someone who hadn't yet learned to unsee things, noticed the box under the princess's arm. She noticed that the princess did not acknowledge her as she passed, which was unusual enough to file. Charlotte was a woman who noticed staff, who called them by their correct names without being reminded, who said good morning and meant it as more than a social formality. Not acknowledging Priya meant the princess was somewhere other than the corridor she was walking through. Priya mentioned it to no one that afternoon. By the next morning she would understand why she should have. Inside the sitting room, Charlotte read the letters again. There were 11 of them. Handwritten, which was itself a choice, handwriting being harder to deny, harder to claim was misrepresented or taken out of context, the particular vulnerability of ink on paper being something the writer had either not thought through or had not cared about, which suggested a certainty that these letters would never be read by anyone they were not written to. They were written over a period of roughly 18 months. They were not addressed to Charlotte. They were not written by Charlotte. They were written by Camilla, and they were addressed to a man whose name Charlotte recognized with the particular sick recognition of understanding not just who he was but what his role had been, what his access had meant, what decisions had moved through his hands. The letters were not love letters. They were operational. This was the part that took the longest to absorb. Charlotte had prepared herself, reading the first one, for a personal betrayal, the kind of thing that wounds the heart and leaves the mind intact enough to function. The heart can be broken and still the mind knows what to do next. But these letters were not about that. They were about decisions. About arrangements. About a careful, structured intervention in events that had been allowed to look accidental, that had been made to look like they belonged to the natural order of things rather than to the deliberate hands of people who wanted a particular outcome. They were about Charlotte's marriage. About its end. About the means by which its end had been assisted. She had believed, for 3 years, that her marriage had ended because of what had happened between her and her husband, because of the specific, painful, ordinary failure of two people who had started with something real and let it erode through the ordinary pressures of a life lived under extraordinary scrutiny. She had accepted this. She had done the work of accepting it, the long, private, effortful work that no one saw because it happened in rooms without cameras and at hours when the public face could be set aside. She had come to a place that was not peace exactly but was functional, a life that moved forward, that had meaning, that was not organized around a wound. The letters reorganized everything. Because the erosion had not been only ordinary. The pressures had not been only the natural kind. Someone had been in the structure of her marriage the way termites are inward, invisible, patient, and systemic, doing damage that looks, from the outside, like the wood simply got old. Camilla had known. Had directed. Had corresponded with a man who had access and had used it. Charlotte sat with this for a long time. Outside the sitting room window the day was doing its indifferent English thing. Traffic sounds reached her from beyond the gates, muffled by distance and stone. Somewhere in the palace a door closed. Someone laughed, briefly, far away. She was thinking about 18 months. About the specific 18 months covered by the letters and what had been happening in her life during that period and what she had attributed those things to. She was laying the letters over her memory of that time the way you lay a transparency over a photograph, watching the two images align, watching what she had thought was one picture reveal itself to be another. By the time the first tear came, she had already stopped being surprised by it. What she felt was not grief, exactly. It was older than grief. It was the specific feeling of understanding that something you spent years surviving was not what you thought you were surviving, and that the surviving itself, the strength you thought you demonstrated, had been built on a false account of events. It was not weakness to cry at that. It was, in fact, the only honest response available to a person with enough self-awareness to understand what had just been taken from them. But Charlotte was also, and this was the thing that made her dangerous, the thing that made the breakdown not the end of the story but a hinge point in it, she was also very, very smart. She did not cry for long. She let herself have it, the full thing, without management, without performing recovery for an empty room, and then she stopped. Not because she was done feeling it. Because she understood that she had a decision to make, and that the decision required her to be thinking clearly, and that crying and thinking clearly were not, for her, compatible states. She put the letters back in the box. She looked at the box for a long moment. She made her decision. Meanwhile, on the other side of a wall that was thicker than it looked, James Whitmore was building his own picture from smaller materials. He had started, carefully, to look into what he'd heard. Not aggressively, he was not reckless, had never been reckless, had kept his career through 12 years precisely because he understood the difference between noticing and acting on what he noticed. He looked at personnel records, at staffing histories, at the quiet overlaps in scheduling that no one had been asked to explain because no one had known to ask. He talked to a colleague who had been at the palace longer than he had, a woman named Elaine who had the particular institutional memory of someone who had always paid attention without ever making it visible. He asked careful questions that sounded like other questions. He listened to what he was told and, more importantly, to what he wasn't. He found the name of the man in the letters, not through the letters, which he hadn't yet seen, but through a different path, a lateral approach to the same information. He found the name through the staffing records and through Elaine's memory of a period, roughly 3 years ago, when that name had appeared and, then, disappeared with an abruptness that had been papered over with a vague official explanation no one had pushed on because the official explanation had been delivered with enough confidence that pushing on it had felt unnecessary. He noted the period. He noted that it overlapped with the ending of Charlotte's marriage. He sat with that overlap the way you sit with something you know is significant before you understand exactly why. He did not yet know about the box. He did not yet know what Charlotte had found or what she was deciding. But the palace had a way of making things known without announcing them. It breathed information the way old buildings breathe damp, through the walls, through the floors, through the particular quality of silences and glances and the way people who knew things moved through rooms. Whitmore had lived in that breathing long enough to read it. Something was moving toward the surface. He could feel it. He went back to the part of his notes where he'd written the word letters and he underlined it once, and then he closed the notebook and he thought about what kind of person writes letters about something like this, about what confidence or recklessness or combination of the two you'd need to put something operational in ink and trust that it would stay hidden. He thought, you'd need to be very sure of the hiding place. He thought, and very sure of the person doing the hiding. He thought, which means somewhere there's a person who arranged the hiding, and that person either still works here or left a way back in. He thought about who that person might be. He was getting close. He didn't know yet that Charlotte was closer. He didn't know yet that Charlotte had already arrived at the answer and was sitting with it in a closed room, deciding what to do with a truth that was going to be very difficult for a great number of people, none of whom had been consulted about whether they wanted it. The palace moved around both of them, maintaining its surfaces. The flagged courtyard held its tourists. The clocks kept their time. The corridors maintained their quiet. Underneath it all, something was shifting. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise until it's already finished moving, and, by then, what was stable is no longer stable and, the landscape has changed and, everyone who thought they knew where they stood has to look down to find their footing again. It was coming. Neither Charlotte nor Whitmore could stop it now even if they'd wanted to. They didn't want to. That was perhaps the most important thing about both of them, the thing that would determine what happened next. They were people who, when confronted with an ugly truth, moved toward it rather than away. They came from different worlds, operated at different levels of the same institution, had different stakes and different risks. But, in this they were alike. When the thing came, when it broke the surface and the palace's careful silence finally cracked along the fault line that had been forming since that Tuesday afternoon in the archive room, they would both be ready for it. Ready, and on the right side of it. The box sat in Charlotte's sitting room with its false reference number, holding its 11 letters, waiting for whatever came next. The palace kept its silence. But silence, as anyone who has listened to enough of it knows, is not the same as nothing happening. Something was happening. It had already started. Charlotte did not go to anyone above her first. This was the choice that surprised people later, when the shape of what happened became visible, the choice that most of the analysts and the commentators and the people who thought they understood palace dynamics got wrong in their reconstruction of events. They assumed she had gone up. That was how power was supposed to work, upward, through channels, following the established routes that existed precisely for moments when individuals encountered things larger than themselves. The entire architecture of the institution was built on that principle. You escalated. You deferred. You trusted the structure to manage what you couldn't manage alone. Charlotte didn't do that. She had thought about it seriously, carefully, with the same analytical attention she brought to everything. She had sat in the sitting room for most of that first afternoon, running through the available options the way a strategist runs through moves on a board, forward and backward, tracing each possible path to its probable outcome. She had considered going to the private secretary. She had considered going to the senior counsel. She had considered making one specific call to one specific person at a level high enough to guarantee the matter would be taken seriously. She had considered each of these options and she had understood, clearly and without the comfort of self-deception, why none of them would work. The letters had been hidden inside the official archive system. That required knowledge of how the system worked and access to it. The access was not broad. The archive system of the residential wing was managed by a small number of people, all of them long-serving, all of them vetted, all of them considered part of the trusted inner circle of the household. The number of people who could have placed that box in that location, labeled it with a false reference number convincing enough to remain undiscovered for 2 years, was small. More significantly, the letters themselves referenced decisions. Arrangements. The phrase "the matter has been managed" appeared twice, in the careful, detached language of someone who has learned to discuss consequential things in terms that don't quite name them. Those decisions had required cooperation, and cooperation of that kind required reach. Not just into the household but into the layers of professional and personal life that surrounded a royal marriage, the legal structures, the communications, the people who handled the 1,000 logistical and practical details of a life that was never fully private. Someone with reach had done this. Someone with reach was still, as far as Charlotte could determine, present. Going upward meant going toward people who operated in the same space as that reach. She did not know which of them knew. She did not know if any of them knew. But she understood that the risk of being wrong about that, of taking the letters to someone who turned out to be connected to what the letters described, was a risk she could not afford to take. If the box disappeared before anything was documented, if she was managed in the way that the letters suggested her marriage had been managed, then, not only would the truth remain buried but, she would lose the thing she had found and, with it, any leverage she had over what came next. She would not be managed. So she went sideways instead. She found James Whitmore. Or rather, she created the conditions for him to find her, which was not the same thing but served the same purpose, and which she did through the particular indirection of someone who has spent a lifetime performing naturalness in front of people paid to observe them. She arranged to be in a part of the corridor she didn't normally occupy at a time that put her in proximity to his post. She made it look like the kind of thing that happened, a change in routine with the unremarkable quality of a choice rather than a plan. He came to her. Or she let him come to her. The distinction was technical. The conversation they had was short, and it happened in the particular compressed vocabulary of two people who understood they were in a space where what they said could be heard. Charlotte was practiced in this, in the art of the half-statement that fully communicates, in the loaded word that does the work of a paragraph, in the use of silence as a carrier of meaning. Whitmore, she discovered, was also practiced in it. He was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't allowed herself to fully form an expectation. He was careful in the way that came from discipline rather than timidity, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes people who are actually thinking about what they hear from people who are just waiting to respond. She told him, in 3 sentences, what she had found. She did not name the letters. She did not name Camilla. She said enough that he could confirm or contradict what he already suspected, and she watched his face as she said it, and what she saw in his face told her she had come to the right person. He didn't flinch. He didn't perform surprise. He simply absorbed what she said with the same stillness she'd seen in people who receive information they have already, in some form, been preparing for. He said, quietly and without inflection, "I know the name." She said, "Then, you know what this is?" He said, "Yes." That was the entire conversation. They moved apart the way they'd come together, naturally, unremarkably, each continuing in the direction they'd been heading, and anyone watching a recording of that corridor in the next few days would have seen two people passing in a hallway with the brief acknowledgement of people who occupy the same space without belonging to the same world. What they had actually done was lay the foundation of something. Whitmore understood the weight of what he'd been handed. He went home that evening and sat with it, turning it the way you turn a stone, looking at each face of it, understanding what it was and what it wasn't and what would happen depending on which face you showed the world. He had spent his career in service. He was comfortable with that. He had never experienced that service as a conflict with his own conscience because the things he had been asked to do in its name had never required him to be dishonest about what he was doing them for. This was different. He was being asked, not in words, but, in the clear language of implication, to act on something that went against the interests of people he was paid to protect. Camilla was, by any institutional definition, inside the circle of his professional obligation. What Charlotte had handed him was the beginning of something that would, if it moved forward in any direction, move against that circle. He had to decide, alone and without guidance, which obligation was the real one. He decided before he finished dinner. He had joined this work because he believed in something under the institution, something the institution was supposed to serve rather than to protect for its own sake. He had believed in that the way people believe in things that are hard to name exactly but that they feel clearly enough to build their behavior on. He still believed in it. And the letters, as Charlotte had described them, were not a small thing. They were evidence of something that corrupted the institution from inside, that used the machinery of protection and trust to serve individual interest, that operated in the shadow of official authority in a way that made the authority itself a cover for something it was never supposed to cover. He was not going to be part of the cover. So he began to build documentation. He did this with the care and patience of someone who understood that incomplete evidence is often worse than no evidence, that a partial case creates the conditions for a rebuttal that buries everything, that a case needs to be whole before it can be moved. He did not rush. He did not tell anyone outside of the arrangement he had made with Charlotte in that hallway. He went through records. Not all at once, not in any way that would register as a pattern of access if someone was watching the system for patterns. He moved laterally, the way he had been trained to move through threat environments, using cover, varying approach, leaving no concentration of footprint in any one location. He was looking for corroboration of what the letters described. He was looking for the man whose name appeared in the letters, for his movements during the relevant period, for the access points that would have made what the letters described logistically possible. He found things. Not quickly. Over 2 weeks of careful, incremental work, moving through the seams of the record system the way water moves through rock, not forcing, just finding the existing path and following it. He found scheduling records that placed the man at the palace during periods the letters suggested he had been active. He found a gap in the communications log for one specific week, a gap that was an absence of records, but the kind of clean absence that means records had been present and were no longer present, which is a different thing entirely. He found a personnel file that had been amended once, 18 months before the ending of Charlotte's marriage, and amended again shortly afterward, and the amendment was small enough to be invisible unless you were looking specifically for it. He photographed what he could photograph without touching what he photographed. He wrote down what he could not photograph. He built a file. Charlotte, meanwhile, had her own work. She had taken the letters from the archive room and she had done what you do with primary evidence when you understand that the original may be at risk. She had ensured that the information in them existed in more than one place. She had done this quietly, methodically, with the precise attention of someone who has been briefed, over years, on document security and the management of sensitive materials, because being royal is also, in part, being briefed on these things, and she had always paid attention in those briefings. The original box remained in her possession. She kept it in a location that was not her sitting room. A location only she knew. This was its own kind of statement, the keeping of it, the choosing not to return it, the deliberate decision to hold the thing she had accidentally found and to hold it in the full knowledge that people would know it was missing and might come looking. No one came. This told her something. If no one came looking for the box, it meant that either no one knew she had it or that someone knew she had it and had decided, for reasons she could reason through, that coming for it would cost more than the cost of the box remaining where it was. The second option was the more interesting one. The more dangerous one. It meant that whoever had created the hiding place understood that the hiding place had been breached, which meant they were now calculating something, running their own version of the board, deciding which move came next. She was aware that she was in a waiting period that would not wait indefinitely. Whatever was coming had a timeline. She couldn't see the timeline. But she could feel the pressure of it, the sense that the calculation on the other side was reaching its resolution, that a decision was approaching, and that when it arrived it would arrive in a form that required her to have everything ready. She and Whitmore communicated twice more during those 2 weeks, in the same compressed, peripheral way of the first conversation. Each time, they exchanged information in the smallest quantity necessary. Each time, the picture they were building became a little more whole. By the end of the second week they had something that wasn't complete but was enough to be credible, enough to be independently corroborated, enough to survive the first wave of challenge that would come when they moved it into the open. Enough to do what came next. Because what came next, the step they had both been building toward without naming it directly, the step that required them both to understand they were past the point of turning back, was taking it outside the building. Inside the building it would be managed. They both knew this. Inside the building, the machinery of the institution was too comprehensive, too practiced, too experienced in the management of information that might destabilize the institution, to allow what they had to become public without transformation. It would be received, processed, and it would become something that was acknowledged privately and managed carefully into a form that did not threaten the larger structure. Charlotte would not allow it to become that. She had spent 3 years believing a false account of events. She had done the work of surviving something that had been, in part, constructed. She had come through it with her public function intact and her private self battered, rearranged, but still fundamentally her own. She was not interested in participating in a further construction. She wanted the truth in a place where it could not be quietly managed. Whitmore wanted the same thing, for his own reasons, which were less personal and no less real. They had to decide, together, on the mechanism. This was its own problem, the how of it, the channel, the form. Each option had its risks and its losses. Each option also had its ceiling, the furthest point to which it could take the information before the information was absorbed into a larger frame and reshaped by it. They were looking for the option with the lowest loss and the highest ceiling. They hadn't found it yet. But they were looking. And, somewhere else in the palace, someone was also looking for what was missing, looking for where Charlotte's calculation had arrived, and, beginning, with the deliberate controlled movement of someone who has done this before and is not afraid of it, to prepare the counter. The palace held its breath. The two sides of the thing moved toward each other in the careful, patient way of people who understand that timing is everything and that arriving too early is the same as not arriving at all. The clock moved. The silence held. For now, the counter came on a Thursday. Charlotte was in a meeting when it arrived, one of the long, structured, heavily scheduled meetings that filled the working portion of her public calendar, the kind of meeting that required her to be fully present and visibly engaged and functioning in every outward way, while the other thing, the private thing, moved in the background of her mind with the low persistent hum of something that hasn't resolved yet. She was good at this. She had been good at it for years, the splitting of attention between the face she showed the room and the thought she kept behind it. It had been a survival skill and it had become a natural one. She was making a remark about funding allocation when her personal aide, a young man named Tom who had been with her 4 years and who had learned, through proximity, the particular signals of her attention, placed a folded note on the table in front of her with the smooth, unhurried motion of someone who has been trained to insert urgency into a room without disrupting the room's surface. She finished her sentence. She opened the note under the table edge, read it, and folded it closed. She finished the meeting. The note said 4 words, "They know you have it." She had expected this. She had prepared for this. She had made her preparations the way careful people make preparations, not optimistically, not with confidence that everything would go as planned, but with the understanding that whatever happened she would have options, and that having options was the same as having power over the shape of what came next. She left the meeting and found Tom and said, in the corridor, moving toward her next appointment, "Who?" He said, also moving, also not breaking the corridor's surface, "The aide. The one who was at the East meeting 3 weeks ago." She said, "One of the 3. He said, "The one who stayed." She understood. Of the 3 unknown faces that had appeared the morning after her breakdown, 2 had been transient, brought in for a specific hour, gone before noon. The 3rd had stayed longer. She had noted the staying at the time as something to observe and had assigned Tom the task of identifying the face without appearing to identify it. He had done this over the following weeks with the patience she'd come to expect from him, and what he'd found was a name and a set of connections that confirmed, without leaving visible fingerprints, that the 3rd person had access to Camilla's circle. A link. Not proof of knowledge. But the beginning of a chain. And, now that Link had moved, had done something, said something, made a call or sent a message that had put the right words into the wrong ear, and the result was that the people who had placed that box in the archive room now knew that the box was no longer where they'd left it. Charlotte went to her next appointment. She was in it for 40 minutes. Then, she made a call. She made it from a handset she'd obtained outside the palace's internal communications system, a practical precaution that had seemed, when she'd arranged it 2 weeks earlier, possibly excessive, and that seemed now exactly calibrated. She called a number she had spent 3 days thinking about before she dialed it for the first time, 10 days ago, establishing the connection that she was now activating. The call lasted 11 minutes. She came out of that call with the mechanism they'd been looking for. The decision to go outside the palace had required, as all such decisions do, the identification of a specific outside at a person or institution with the standing and the independence to receive what she and Whitmore had built and do something with it that couldn't be quietly reversed. The options were not many. Each of the obvious ones had complications: proximity to the institution, existing relationships, potential leverage points that could be used to apply pressure at the moment of publication or disclosure or whatever form the outside would ultimately take. The person she had called was a woman named Claire Ashworth, a solicitor who specialized in a very particular kind of case, the kind where powerful institutions have behaved toward individuals in ways that the institutions preferred not to have examined. Charlotte had known of her by reputation for years, the way you know of people in adjacent worlds without ever having reason to enter theirs. She had called her for the first time 10 days ago and had spoken in general terms that were specific enough to establish credibility and vague enough to preserve deniability. She had felt, by the end of that call, that she had found the right person. Claire Ashworth was not the kind of woman who was impressed by the weight of the institution. She was the kind of woman who had spent 20 years understanding exactly how much that weight was designed to compress rather than to protect, and she had built her career on the spaces where that weight could be contested. She was not afraid. She was, if anything, interested. She was also, and this was the thing that had taken those 10 days to determine, genuinely independent. No existing relationship with the palace or its adjacent legal infrastructure. No ongoing cases that could be used as leverage. No financial exposure that could be threatened. She was the solicitor equivalent of a clear line, no static, no interference, signal going directly from one end to the other. After the 11-minute call, Claire Ashworth had what she needed to begin formal preparation of documentation. The original letters, which Charlotte would provide. Whitmore's corroborating file, which Whitmore would provide. And Charlotte's own account, structured, dated, describing in legal sequence what she had found and when and what she had done with it and why. The account was the part Charlotte had been preparing for 2 weeks. She had written it in fragments, late at night, in the flat handwriting of someone who was choosing each word with the care of someone who knows their words are going to be read in a room designed to test them. She had written it without sentimentality and without the temptation, which was considerable, to let the personal weight of it show in the language. She had described the events in the order they occurred and the decisions she had made and the reasons for each decision, and she had read it back to herself 3 times to find the places where the emotion was visible in the phrasing and had replaced the phrasing with something that did the same work without the visible weight. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. Meanwhile, Whitmore, who had been separately informed that the counter had come through Tom, through the same careful peripheral channel, was doing what he did in the face of pressure, which was to become more still. He had his file. He had known for the past 4 days that the file was ready. He had also known that readiness is not the same as movement, that you hold a complete thing until the moment it's needed and, no longer, because a thing moved prematurely is a thing that can be caught in motion. The moment was now. He made his own call, separately, to Claire Ashworth's office, not knowing Charlotte had called from a different line an hour earlier, and finding out when Claire Ashworth's assistant mentioned, with professional discretion, that the matter was already active. He absorbed this with the equanimity of someone who has gotten used to Charlotte being 1 step ahead. He provided what he had to provide. He answered the questions that came with the specificity and the precision of someone who understood that vague is useless in legal preparation. By late Thursday afternoon, Claire Ashworth had received, by secure courier, 2 separate packages, one from Charlotte and one from Whitmore. She had read both. She had placed them alongside each other on her desk and spent a long time looking at them, not reading, just looking, the way you look at something before you pick it up fully, because once you pick it up you are responsible for the weight of it. Then, she picked it up. Inside the palace, the Thursday moved at its own pace. The third face, the one who had sent the message, the link to Camilla's circle, had been busy. Charlotte could reconstruct, from what Tom brought her in the following hours, the rough shape of what was being organized on the other side. Someone was working toward a conversation with Charlotte that would be designed to feel informal and would be anything but. A meeting of the kind that is offered as a courtesy and is in fact an assessment, an attempt to determine what she had, what she intended, and whether there was still time to redirect the intended trajectory of it. She would decline the meeting. She did decline it, through Tom, with the kind of gracious regret that closes a door without visibly slamming it. The declining of the meeting was, itself, a communication. It said, "I know what the meeting is for." It said, "I am past the point where that kind of management is available to you." It said, "Whatever you are planning to do on the other side of this, you should plan it without the assumption that you have time to redirect me." She received, the following morning, a response to the declining of the meeting. The response was not a message. It was a visit. She had been expecting something. She had not been certain of the form. A visit meant in person, which meant someone had decided that the weight of the matter required a human presence, eye contact, the particular pressure of a face across a table. Someone senior. Someone whose presence was itself a statement about how seriously the other side was taking this. The visitor was a woman Charlotte had known for years. A woman who operated at a level of the palace's internal structure that made her appearance in Charlotte's sitting room on a Friday morning the clearest possible signal of where the counter had originated and how far it was prepared to go. Charlotte offered her tea. The woman sat across from her at the small table by the window and said, without preamble and with the directness of someone who had decided that indirection was no longer useful, "You understand what you're setting in motion?" Charlotte said, "Yes." The woman said, "And you're continuing?" Charlotte said, "Yes." The woman looked at her for a moment. She was not, Charlotte noticed, angry. She was the thing that is harder to navigate than anger, which is disappointed but not surprised, the look of someone who had known this was coming and had hoped to be wrong and was now in the position of managing the thing they'd hoped to avoid managing. She said, "There will be consequences you haven't anticipated." Charlotte said, "There already have been." "On your end." The woman was quiet. Charlotte poured tea. She set the cup in front of the woman with the precise, unhurried movement of someone who was entirely comfortable in a situation that would unsettle most people. This was, she had learned in her years in this world, one of the few advantages of having been managed. Having been managed taught you, with brutal precision, exactly what management felt like from the inside, and, once you knew that feeling, you recognized it instantly and could choose not to accept it. She was not accepting it. She said, "I found the letters by accident. I had them read by independent legal counsel. What happens next is out of my hands, which is the point. It was always going to be out of my hands either because you put it there or because I did, and I preferred to be the one." The woman set her tea down without drinking it. She said, "Camilla doesn't know you're doing this." This was interesting. Charlotte heard it and filed it, not as exculpatory, not as a reason to slow what was already in motion, but as information. The visitor was telling her something about the current state of knowledge on the other side, and what it told her was that the chain between Camilla and the counter was longer than one link. The person sitting across from her was not operating on direct instruction. She was operating on inference and institutional instinct, the reflex of someone who understood what discovery of those letters would mean and was trying to manage the fallout in the space before the principal became fully aware. This meant Camilla might not know. Or it meant the visitor wanted Charlotte to believe Camilla didn't know. She kept both options open. She said, "Then, that's something she and I will have to speak about separately." The visitor looked at her with something that was almost, in a different context, respect. She stood. She thanked Charlotte for the tea she hadn't drunk. She left. Charlotte sat at the table for a moment after the door closed, then she stood and went to the window and looked at the courtyard below where two tourists were photographing the guards and a pigeon was doing something offended on the cobblestones and the day was doing its ordinary grey English thing with perfect indifference to everything happening above it. She thought, "It's done now." Not finished. Done in the sense that it had passed the point where it could be undone. The documentation was with Claire Ashworth. The file was with Claire Ashworth. The account was with Claire Ashworth. Whatever happened next would happen in a space that was no longer controlled by the institution, and, in that space, the institution's tools, the management, the redirection, the careful transformation of inconvenient truths into manageable narratives, would not work the same way. She had set it in motion. She was not afraid of what came next. She had examined the fear and found that it was smaller than she'd expected, which told her something about the size of the anger underneath it, the anger she had been quietly carrying since she first read those letters in the archive room, standing up because her legs had forgotten how to find a chair. The anger was appropriate. The anger was, in fact, the correct response to what had been done and the correct fuel for what she was doing about it. She let herself have it. The way she had let herself have the other thing, in the sitting room 3 weeks ago, fully, without management, as the honest response of a person who had been dealt with dishonestly. Then, she stepped back from the window. There was more to do. There was always more to do. She was ready for it, the truth, when it finally moved in the way that things move when they have been building pressure for a long time behind a wall, not gradually, not in stages, but, all at once, with the force of something that had always been going somewhere and was finally going there. Claire Ashworth was thorough. She had spent 2 weeks with what Charlotte and Whitmore had given her, building the legal architecture around it the way an engineer builds around a load-bearing element, with precision, with redundancy, and with a clear understanding of what happens if any single point fails. She had brought in as second counsel someone with a specific expertise in royal household law, a man named Devereux who had worked for 20 years in the exact kind of case where powerful institutions preferred that certain things remain private and whose entire professional reputation was built on the principle that preference did not constitute a right. Together they constructed what would eventually be described, in the formal language of the process that followed, as a comprehensive disclosure document. 11 original letters, fully authenticated. A corroborating file of institutional records covering 37 pages, every page sourced and dated and cross-referenced. Charlotte's written account, 12 pages, plain and sequential and devastating in the way that plain and sequential things are devastating when the events they describe are not plain at all. And Whitmore's testimony, separate, independent, arriving at the same place from a different starting point, which is the most reliable kind of corroboration, the kind that cannot be manufactured because it would require two people who are not coordinating to arrive, without planning, at the same truth. The document went to 3 places simultaneously. This was Claire Ashworth's decision, and it was the right one. A single destination could be managed, pressured, delayed, persuaded of the wisdom of discretion, offered considerations that made discretion feel like the more reasonable choice. 3 destinations simultaneously was a different matter. 3 meant that suppression required not 1 conversation but 3 run at the same time, without the destinations knowing about each other, which was practically impossible to execute cleanly. 3 meant that if the institution moved against one, the other 2 would know why, and the knowing would itself become part of the story. The destinations were a legal institution, a specific court registrar with jurisdiction over the relevant type of claim. A journalism organization, not a tabloid, not the kind of outlet that would run the story as salacious palace gossip, but a long-form publication with the institutional seriousness and legal resources to defend what it published and the editorial integrity to ensure that what it published was accurate. And, a third, a specific individual within the broader royal family structure, a person with standing and independence who had, over years, developed a reputation for being willing to do the uncomfortable thing when the uncomfortable thing was the right one. The third destination was the most delicate. It required a judgment about trust that could not be made from the evidence alone, a judgment about character, about what a person would do when handed something that destabilized the institution they inhabited. Charlotte had made that judgment over a long time, with the care she brought to all judgments of that kind. She had made it before she found the letters. Actually, it was a judgment she had arrived at slowly, through years of observation, and the finding of the letters had not changed the judgment so much as activated it. When all 3 received the document, within the same 2-hour window on a cold Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the day Charlotte had stood in the archive room and read a letter that was not addressed to her, the institution felt it. This was not metaphor. There was a specific, observable moment when the knowledge that 3 destinations had received the document reached the center of the institution's awareness, and the response to that moment was the kind of response that occurs when an organization built on the management of information encounters information it cannot manage. The response was not calm. It was controlled, because the institution's training was comprehensive and its people were experienced. But beneath the control was something that was not calm, something that moved through the internal channels the way a charge moves through a wire, fast, invisible from the outside, and capable of doing damage if it hit something it wasn't supposed to. Camilla learned on a Wednesday. Charlotte didn't know the exact moment. She didn't need to. She knew because of the call she received, at 11 in the morning, through channels that should not have been able to reach her private line, from a number she recognized but had not expected to see on her screen. She let it ring 3 times. She picked up. The conversation lasted 26 minutes. Charlotte had not prepared for it, had not scripted it, had made no notes and set no agenda because she understood that this particular conversation couldn't be prepared for in the ordinary way, that its content would be determined by what arrived on the other end of the line, and her preparation needed to be internal rather than tactical. She needed to be very clear about what she wanted and what she didn't want, and she needed to be clear about the difference between the two, because in a conversation of this kind those two things can look similar enough to be confused. What she wanted was not revenge. She had examined this carefully. Revenge has a particular quality in the wanting of it, a heat, a narrowness, a focus on the other person's experience of consequence. What she wanted was something colder and broader. She wanted the account to be accurate. She wanted the 3 years she'd spent surviving something she'd misunderstood to be counted correctly, to be named correctly, to be part of the public record in a way that couldn't be quietly revised or managed into something softer. She wanted the truth to have the kind of permanence that comes from being witnessed. That was it. Not more than that. Camilla, on the other end of the line, was not what Charlotte had anticipated. This was the thing about the conversation that would stay with her longest in the weeks that followed, not the content of it, not the specific words of any specific exchange, but the quality of what was on the other end. She had expected, in some part of herself that she hadn't examined too closely, something that would make the thing easier. Something that confirmed the image she'd built from the letters, the image of calculation, deliberateness, the cold management of another person's life. Something that would let the anger stay clean. It wasn't clean. It was complicated in the way that things are complicated when they involve a human being rather than a role, when the person on the other end turns out to be, under everything, a person, with the mess and the fear and the contradictions that persons have. Camilla was not apologetic in the formal, performed way of someone delivering a rehearsed account of their regret. She was something messier. She was defensive at the edges and cracked in the middle, and the cracking was not theatrical and was not managed, and Charlotte, who had spent a lifetime watching people perform emotions and had learned to see the performance beneath the performance, recognized in the cracking something that was not managed at all. She didn't soften. She also didn't harden further. She stayed where she was, which was a place of steady clarity, not kind, not cruel, simply accurate. She said what she had found. She said what she understood about what the letters described. She said that what she had put in motion was in motion, and that it was going to continue, and that she was not calling this conversation to negotiate that. She was calling, she said, because she believed that Camilla deserved to know from her, directly, before she knew from somewhere else. There was silence on the other end of that. Then, Camilla said something Charlotte hadn't expected. She said, "I thought it was what was needed." This was the most honest thing she said in the 26 minutes. Charlotte knew it was the most honest thing because of the way it arrived, without preface, without the slight organizing pressure of a thought that has been shaped before speaking. It arrived raw, which meant it had not been prepared, which meant it was what was actually there. Charlotte sat with it for a moment. She said, "I know." She said, "That's what makes it worse." The silence after that lasted a long time. When the conversation ended, Charlotte sat with the handset in her hand and looked at the wall of her room for a moment in the way she'd looked at the archive room wall 6 weeks earlier, before the 4 minutes and 22 seconds of stillness, before everything that had followed from that stillness. Then, she set the handset down. James Whitmore found out about the call the following day, through Tom, and he received the information with the equanimity that had by now become his primary register in this entire situation. He had been, throughout, steady, not because he was unaffected, but because steadiness was what the situation required, and he had identified steadiness as his contribution to it from the beginning. He had done his part. He had built his file. He had given it to the right hands. He was now in the part of the process where what he had built was doing its work without him, and his job was to maintain his post, maintain his professional presence, and not do anything that added to the already considerable weight of what was in motion. He was good at this. He was, perhaps, better at this than at anything else he'd done in 12 years. The formal disclosure process moved at its own pace, the measured, unrushed pace of legal and journalistic processes that are built for robustness rather than speed, that move slowly because the slowness is part of the integrity, that arrive at their destinations fully formed rather than partial. Charlotte had known this would be the pace of it. She had made her peace with the waiting during the weeks of preparation, and now she inhabited the waiting with the same clarity she'd brought to the preparation. She went about her public life. She attended her appointments. She smiled in the places where smiling was required and was graven the places where gravity was required, and she was, externally, exactly what she had always appeared to be: composed, present, fully functioning in the role that had organized her public existence for decades. The people who saw her in those weeks saw nothing different. Saoirse, the junior housemaid who had been the first to know that something was wrong 6 weeks earlier, who had knocked on the sitting room door and found what she found and gone to Mrs. Drummond with 3 flat words, watched Charlotte pass through the corridor one morning and had the strange, disorienting experience of seeing someone who looked exactly as they'd always looked and knowing, from the small specific evidence of what she'd witnessed and what she'd heard whispered since, that the person in front of her was not the same person who had been there 6 weeks ago. Not changed in ways that diminished. Changed in the way that things change when they've been through something and come out still themselves, an alteration that is a loss but is irreversible. A person who has decided something, fully, and is living in the clarity of that decision. Charlotte looked up as she passed. She said, "Good morning, Saoirse." She got her name right. She always got everyone's name right. The corridor held the sound of her heels for a moment after she'd rounded the corner, and then it was just a corridor again, with the clocks ticking and the flowers arranged by careful hands and the light coming through the high windows in the particular way it came through high windows in old buildings, as if light, too, were a kind of institution, consistent, daily, arriving on schedule regardless of what the day held. Whitmore heard the official announcements, when they came, through the same channels everyone heard them. The legal acknowledgement. The editorial note at the bottom of a long and carefully sourced piece that ran in the publication. Claire Ashworth had selected a piece that named the letters, described their content in formal terms, described the corroborating documentation, and placed the whole account in the context of a claim that had been formally lodged. The piece was not sensational. It was precise. It was the kind of journalism that is harder to dismiss than sensational journalism because it has nothing to work with except facts and it has arranged those facts in an order that cannot be rearranged. He read it at his kitchen table. He read it twice. He sat with it for a while. He thought about the morning 6 weeks ago when he had stood at his post and felt the silence in the east wing and understood that something had shifted without being able to name what it was. He thought about standing in that corridor and catching the fragments of a conversation through a closed door, the way fragments reach you, not the whole sentence but the words with the most weight. Letters. She was never supposed to find out. He thought about Charlotte's face in the hallway. 3 sentences. The specific economy of it. He thought about what it cost to do what she had done. Not in the political or institutional sense, he had thought about that carefully enough during the preparation to have a clear estimate of those costs. He meant the other cost. The one that doesn't appear in documentation. The cost of taking something private and painful, something you'd been living with in the form of a misunderstanding for 3 years, and making it public. The cost of allowing the world to know that your life had been managed, that the most significant loss of your personal history had been assisted from the outside by hands you hadn't known were there. The cost of accuracy. Of insisting on the correct account. He thought it was the right cost. He thought what she had paid it for was worth what it cost. He put the newspaper down. He got up and went to the window of his kitchen and looked out at the gray morning street, a street entirely unlike the street outside the palace, ordinary and specific and unphotographed, and he felt something that he couldn't precisely name, but that was in the territory of satisfaction, the satisfaction of having done the right thing in the right way and let it arrive where it needed to arrive. Not justice, exactly. He was experienced enough to know that justice was often too clean a word for what actually happened at the end of a thing like this. But something. Something that would not be undone. Something that was now part of the permanent record of events, alongside all the other things that were part of that record, the managed things and the misrepresented things and the things that had been carefully shaped by careful hands. This thing sat now, unchangeable, true. He went back to the table and finished his coffee. He had a shift in 2 hours. He would go to the palace and stand at his post, and the palace would be what it always was: flagged courtyard, tourists, old stone, the long corridors with their soft-shoed staff and their arranged flowers and their ticking clocks. It would look exactly as it had always looked. But it had changed. Things that were true, and knowing a true thing changed the shape of everything around it, even if the surface stayed the same. The surface of the palace would stay the same. The surface always stayed the same. That was what surfaces were for. Underneath it, something had shifted. The real account was now the real account. Charlotte had made sure of that. Standing at his post 2 hours later, Whitmore thought about the word letters, the first time he'd heard it through a closed door, the weight it had carried even before he understood its full weight. He thought about how much had moved from that single word. How far it had traveled. How it had started in a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear and ended in a printed paragraph that anyone could read, that existed now on the public record with the same permanence as every other document that said, "This happened, this is what it was, this is what it meant." He stood at his post. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The palace kept its long, practiced silence. But, underneath it, the truth was breathing. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.